Greetings and salutations. I'm your host, Ivan Francis Wilbanks, and we're back for yet another episode of Cutting the Strings. And today we're talking about mental health. So, if this is a trigger warning for you, if you want to talk about mental health, you can stay. But if you don't want to talk about it today, come back later on. Join us in the next one. Don't worry, it'll be fine. There's more where this came from. So, now, in light of us talking about mental health, I really am just interested in, I guess, talking about a little bit of my own experience and kind of providing a little bit of guidance, just based off of what I've lived through. I'm gonna be honest. In my 32 years of living, I have dealt with a lot of stuff. All right. Now, I'm not saying this to basically get a woe is me or to get people saying, oh my goodness, we feel so sorry for you. Listen, I just want to make it very clear that whatever I'm sharing in this video is not for the intention of trying to get pity or garner sympathy. And also not for the purpose of trying to get a woe is me. But I think it's important just to really talk about experience and how it can contribute to someone's mental health and mental health status. I think a lot of times people just say, oh, this person has mental health issues, and they really never inquire as to why the person has the mental health issue. One thing I think that often we make the mistake of in this society is that we say this person is mentally ill or they got issues or whatever. But we never really think about or ask or inquire about how this person got there. We always act like Rome was built in a day or Rome was just there. And it wasn't just there, right? Unless you were born with some sort of cognitive issue or you were born with some sort of issue where you're unable to process or there's something else going on. But if we're talking about mental health issues from the standpoint of, having anxiety or having depression or having, PTSD, whatever those experiences are, whatever those conditions are, it's not that the person started out like that, right? Some of us had experiences that caused us to form perspectives and cause us to form our own ways of looking at the world and moving about the world that basically cause us to have the condition that we have. Speaking for myself, I just recently got diagnosed with complex post-traumatic stress disorder. What does that mean? Well, complex post-traumatic stress disorder, from what my understanding of it is that it's similar to post-traumatic stress disorder where you are going through a traumatic event, and as a result of the traumatic event, you are basically unable to necessarily adjust due to the event. But when it's complex post-traumatic stress disorder, usually it's a little more based on the fact that it's not a singular event that caused it. It's actually a series of events or a chronic succession of events that basically happened that created a sense of trauma. And so for me, one of those things that I can source and look at throughout my life was being bullied very early in my childhood and not necessarily having any protection against it. And then also dealing with having destroyed self esteem and having the bullying continue into adulthood or having the manipulation continue into adulthood. So that's exactly why I experienced complex post traumatic stress disorder. Now, how did I get here? Well, it took me 5 years of going to therapy. It took me being on a couple different prescription medications. It took me going through a psychologist. It took a lot for me to get here. And I'm actually glad that I've gotten to this place where I can now talk with you about it. I'm glad that I've gotten to a place where I can now clearly see what it was that got me here. And I also will say that for those that have been a contributor, whether it have been in an antagonistic sort of way or protagonistic sort of way, I think that everybody had the role to play in the play of life that we know. In the words of Shakespeare, the world's a stage and all the men and women are merely players on it. And I think that this is essentially what my life looked like. My life was a stage and all the men and women, all the theys and all the thems had their own role to play. And so here we are. I'm 32 and I'm living my life here in place of Atlanta. And I got the career that I've wanted or that I asked for. I'm living in a decent house. I'm driving a decent car, a nice car. I'm blessed, right? And I'm not necessarily stating these things as a complaint, But I think that when we look at people's lives and we see what they have, we really don't inquire about what that actually entails, right? Part of the reason why I was driven to become a lawyer, and part of the reason why I was driven to become so economically independent, and I wanted to have home ownership, and I valued that, and I wanted to have a nice car, and all these things is directly related to the fact of I don't want to be taken as a weak person. I don't want to be taken as a throwaway or as a write off. And that directly relates to my experiences in childhood, right? Where nobody listened to me. My voice had no bearing on anything. I was bullied. And when I told people how I felt, people ignored me. When I asked for help, no one helped me. It felt as though after years and years of being ignored, I took the position of if I'm going to do anything to save myself, I'm going to save myself first. And even if it means going through the route of making the mistake of shape shifting and turning myself into a product and willing to adjust myself for what other people's consumption, right? I made that mistake, but also did it in a way and in a space of I wanted to survive. A lot of times, especially when you're talking to people who are from disenfranchised disenfranchised or marginalized groups, we experience this more than our counterparts because we are moving about the world in a way where we're told we're not enough. We're told we'll never be enough. We're told that because of our skin color, because of our sexual orientation, because of our gender, we're not worthy enough. And so you get this programming, you get these statements over and over again. And rather than them necessarily rolling off of your back, right? People also enact their will upon you and they do things to you to not only just, make it stick, but reinforce what they're saying. And so I remember very vividly growing up, I was unable to sit in the lunchroom and eat lunch with all the other kids because I was bullied so badly and I didn't feel comfortable sitting in a lunchroom with other kids. So what I would do is I remember as early as I was like 10 years old, I would basically avoid sitting in the lunchroom and go to tutoring. I didn't need to go to tutoring, but I would go to tutoring during lunch. Or I would hide in a family member's office because I had a family member that worked at the school that I was attending. I would hide in their office. Or I would just basically, avoid, I would basically sit in the lunchroom. I would sit in the lunchroom in a very nondescript spot, like off to the side, if I had to sit in the lunchroom, because I did not want to be in that pool of people who were actively attacking me, and it felt like I had nothing in common with anybody as early as 8, 9, 10, 11 years old, right? And even though I tried to socialize with other kids in my school, they didn't want no parts of me. I was getting called faggot. I was getting called gay. I was getting told, my mom's a man, your dad's a janitor because my dad worked at the school. I was getting told all manners of crazy things. And it was not even just like, okay, sticks and stones, you may break my bones, but words will never hurt me sort of thing. It was like constant, incessant, over and over, day in and day out for years at a time that this would go on. And it just escalated. I remember by the time I was in high school, I was getting, physically assaulted. Things were getting stolen. I had my senior year of high school. I remember, I'll actually take it back to junior year of high school. In my junior year of high school, I remember I got suspended because I just flipped out. I flipped out and got suspended from school because I was getting bullied so bad that I just lost it. And I just was like, I can't do it. I was literally going home from school every day with headaches, like headaches every single day. And, I remember also that when I first tried to self delete, because I can't say the word on YouTube, when I tried to first self delete, I was 15 years old. And I was, again, in this place of getting called a faggot every day, getting told I was this, getting told, I hope you get AIDS and you die. I was hearing all manners of crazy things. And I would tell my parents would say sticks and stones may break my bones, that sort of speech. And school administration, mind you, my aunt owned the school. She was in school administration. She did nothing really. She just said, well, you just need to tell. And I would tell, but nothing would happen. I would tell, and these kids would still come in, still harass me, still bully me. And it would just be nonstop, day in and day out, right? And it just felt like I had no escape. I couldn't transfer schools. I tried to transfer schools, and that was blocked. There were a lot of things that in my own experience, I had to live through and say, you know what? Very early in my formative years, a lot of this stuff was happening and it shouldn't have happened. And that's not even counting the things that were happening at home, right? And I just felt like after a certain point, it was like, yeah, I'm smart. I'm getting good grades, but I'm getting bullied and nobody's listening to me. I'm talking to teachers and nobody's listening to me. I'm telling my parents and nobody's listening to me. Nobody's helping me. And I just said, you know what? Like, I just gave up. I just gave up after a certain point because I'm fighting a battle against groups of people, groups of other children who are my age, and nobody seems to give a fuck. I was just like, nobody seemed to care. I was telling my parents, and my parents are too invested in their own things that they had going on. And I get it. They were doing the best that they could. They were working. I get it. But it was just like, I just had no escape. And I remember by the time I was 15 or 16, I already had decided I was out. I was leaving Philly. I was no longer willing to live in a place where I felt no sense of protection. I was standing on the subway platform. And I remember having people threatening to push me into the subway tracks. Or saying like, I'm gonna get my cousin to fuck you up and just crazy stuff. And I would say something, I would report it, and nothing would happen, and it would just be incessantly going on. And at that point, I said, in order for me to survive, in order for me to get out of this place, I need to do whatever is possible to get as good as grades as possible and tap dance as best as possible to get the hell out of this place and go somewhere else. And I made it my mission at 15 and 16 to leave Philly and never come back. And honestly, that mission was largely successful. I've been away from Philly pretty much since I've been 18 years old. I've only gone back probably once for a long period of time. When I was taking the bar exam the first time and I failed it, and I went to take it a second time, I went back. But aside from that, I mean, I've stayed away from Philly since I've been 18 years old, and I've been living independently ever since, somewhere else. Um, and going through that experience, it helped push me to become an independent, self-sufficient person. It pushed me to be excellent because I knew, okay, in order for me to leave, I have to get good grades and go to college and be in the top of my game. So when I graduated from high school, I was fifth in the class. I had a scholarship to go to Howard, and I went. And I just said, you know what, I'm gonna go. I'm gonna beast Howard, and I'm gonna go to law school, and I'm going to run circles around everybody else. That was my thought process. It was, I'm going to be so proficient and so competent that y'all are not going to talk shit about me ever again. And that was my thought process in my 17-year-old mind. And when I came out at 18, 2 weeks before I went to college, you know, my mom asked me, why would you choose this lifestyle? And granted, I understood, my mom and I are cool now. But the one thing I said to her was, I said, Mom, who actively chooses this? I was like, who actively chooses this? I was like, nobody chooses to be ostracized, marginalized, told that they hope they got AIDS and died, told that I hope your cousin comes and shoots you in the head, and all manners of really vile, evil, nasty things. Who chooses this? And when I said this to her, she was like, just gape. She couldn't say anything because it's the truth. Who chooses that? I knew I wouldn't have chose that if I had known. And it dovetailed perfectly into me leaving. And when I left, I dealt with a lot of other things after leaving. I dealt with, people. I dealt with, going to college and thinking I had friends. And these same friends would go out in a part of DC I wasn't familiar with, and they would run off, take off running, and leave me. And I wouldn't know where I was. Or, I would be left stood up for 45 minutes to an hour to 2 hours. People would make plans, and then, I would go to the place where we said we were going to meet up at, and they would never show up. I would call, no answer. I had a lot of people even questioning and doubting my ability to do certain things. I'm a member of a fraternal organization, and I had people when I was in college and I was in my undergraduate years. I actually ended up crossing and joining my fraternal organization as a graduate or as a post undergraduate. But when I was an undergraduate and I was pursuing the same organization, I was told that, me being a gay man and me being feminine presenting was a liability. And, it was, oh, he's weak, and people were asking, well, what are we going to do with openly gay prospects? And I'm just sitting here like, I'm still a man at the end of the day. I lived in a world where, because I was plus sized, or rather thicker than most, I was told that, okay, my waist size would be the reason why I would never find love. And my voice not being deep enough, that would be the reason why I would never get taken seriously. And when I would enter spaces, right, that would not even just be the word or the pronouncement, but people would actively act and do things socially to marginalize me or ostracize me. And this was a recurring theme, month after month, year after year. It didn't take until I became 26 years old, 26, for me to finally start feeling a sense of things turning around. And at that point, I had finished law school. I had, went through law school, and I'm gonna be telling you this, it's a haze in and of itself. And even when I was in law school, I remember it was our president was in his first term, or rather, Trump was in his first term, rather. And I remember being told while I was at Emory Law School, "Oh, you're an affirmative action student." Like, and I'm just like, what? But again, I'm constantly being placed in these environments where I'm told I'm not enough, but then not only being told I wasn't enough, but people enacting their will to demonstrate or to make an example out of me, showing I wasn't enough. And so you can kind of imagine that after going through these experiences years and years and years on end, with no rectification, with no recourse, with no nothing, you get to a point where you're like, well, damn, do I have a sense of value? Do I have a sense of worth? Do I have a sense of even belonging? Right? Like, there were points where I often questioned why I even continued to exist on earth. There were times where I had been held at gunpoint. I had been held at gunpoint at least 3 separate times in my life. And thankfully, I'm still alive to tell the tale. There have been times where I've been put in really dangerous situations that have been set up by people. And if it wasn't for the fact that I was able to escape at the time that I escaped, I would not be sitting here talking to you today. There have been times where I've also had to, do strange things for change, right? Again, not proud of it, but at the end of the day, I needed to survive. And I think at the end of the day, looking back on all these experiences now at 32, when I'm now living in this space and I have a degree and I'm in law school, I'm now past law school and I'm practicing law, and I've been practicing law for years. And, I'm in this place now where it's like, looking back, I shouldn't be where I'm at right now. But if it wasn't for some sort of divine intervention, or if it wasn't for some sort of spiritual movement, I probably would not be here. And so, looking back at all of those things, I'm like, wow. All right. So when I turned 26, I decided I was going to take the driver's seat and making sure that my mental health and my physical health were in alignment. And granted, my physical health is not the best. I'm working on that. But I said, I'm going to at least get my mental health in order to some extent. And I'm going to be honest, it probably was the best thing I could have ever possibly done. Because when I sought out my first therapist, I had a Black woman therapist as my first therapist, and her name was Hanifa. She was amazing. Hanifa, if you're watching this, girl, you were absolutely amazing, and I appreciate you immensely. And, she was amazing because she helped me get through a lot of things that, I would not have even thought that I was going through. She helped me put words and language to things that I did not have language and words for. Because I think the big thing, especially when you're a Black person living in America, or any part of the world, really, for that matter, one of the biggest things in the diaspora that we struggle with as Black people is the notion of actually looking at our mental health in the same way that we look at our physical health. And I think that a lot of it has to do with colonialism. A lot of it has to do with religion and a religious colonialism. A lot of it has to do with the fact that our parents and our ancestors were not talked about, and we're not encouraged to seek out mental health and look at our mental health in the same way that we look at our physical health. And I was just completely taken aback by the fact that I lived most of my life up to that point with no language, no means of making a meaning with anything, and just no basis of protection for myself, right? Because I was basically exposed to the elements and letting people say and do whatever they wanted to me without any sort of repercussion, because I basically given up. I felt like they had all the social power to say and do whatever they wanted to do. and I had none. So I was just letting people kind of do and say whatever they wanted to do and say, because I was like, well, I mean, I can't defend myself. Or when I do buck back, they're going to find five other people to join in and do something evil or do something cross. So after I've dealt with Hanifa and I worked with her, I moved on to another mental health provider. And honestly, being in therapy really helped me understand a lot more about myself and about where my own blind spots were. But I think the biggest thing, especially in this last year, was now we have to basically find the suspect and put a name on it. Because for the longest, we were working on these things, right? And I was trying to gain the tools. But the biggest thing for a lot of us to understand is that in order for you to address a problem, the first step is admitting that you have one, or at least identifying it. And for me, I had language to describe what I was dealing with and how I felt, but I didn't really have a name for what this was. And so I ended up getting diagnosed with generalized anxiety disorder. I got diagnosed with depression. And then I also got diagnosed with social adjustment and anxiety disorder as well. Because again, it had gotten to a point where I no longer felt confident in even talking to people. I felt like people were judging me before I even had the chance to walk up. Even dating wise, I was unable or incapable of dating because I felt like, okay, I'm just going to get rejected because y'all think that I don't have a porn star body, or I don't have, something that you want, or I don't sound the way you want. So I just automatically counted myself out of the equation because I was given that information from childhood that I wasn't worthy enough. And nobody ever jumped in to counteract that or combat that in my formative years. So when I became an adult, I kind of just resigned myself to it being the truth. And when I went to therapy as an adult, I had to unravel all of that and take the layers back and peel all the layers back from that and understand that it was because of the fact that I was exposed to these elements. You know, I really will say that in the last year, I now feel a lot more confident and comfortable being able to talk about who I am and what I do, and kind of sort of standing more firm in a lot of things. Um, one thing I was kind of debating about was talking about, my relationship. Well, my relationship ended. I'm not going to get into the details of it, but long story short, my relationship has ended. And in my relationship ending, it was a really hard thing for me because I had to really look into myself and figure out what did I do wrong, but also what was mine and what was not mine. And if I were to take accountability for the things that were mine, I could have done a better job of not letting my prior trauma and prior occurrences and prior abusive relationships and how those things formulated how I perceive things color how we resolve conflict. And I also take a look at it from the standpoint of also my tolerance for certain things and exactly knowing what my tolerance is for certain things. I think a lot of times when people deal with depression or they deal with, CPTSD, or they're dealing with, being bullied a lot in their childhood, they also struggle with setting boundaries and also tolerance. And I think that's another thing I had to deal with is I used to tolerate a lot of bullshit, a lot of crazy stuff. I mean, people yelling, screaming, throwing things, putting their hands on me. I mean, I've dealt with all of it. I have been in relationships where people have whooped my ass. I mean, I'm just saying what it is. People have literally gone out of their way to physically abuse me. And people have done things like clear my bank accounts out. People have taken advantage of me in ways that, if it were to be reduced down to a television show, y'all would be looking like, oh my God, really? I've even had, been in relationships where people have said that no one will ever love you. And, they've gone out and cheated in front of my face and just done all manners of really vile things. And my tolerance for it was there because it just kept happening. It kept happening. It kept happening. But with this situation that I found myself in recently, I said, you know what? Do I respect and love me enough to say no? And I think that in this world that we live in now, if I don't give you anything else from this conversation, love and respect yourself enough to say no and don't tolerate bullshit. right? And I think that for me, when I said no, I wasn't willing to tolerate it. Like, one thing I don't tolerate, and this is after experiencing it a little bit too much, especially at my big age, is people yelling and screaming at me. You can be angry, you can be upset. I'm not going to tell you to not have emotions. But the one thing I will not tolerate is have another adult screaming and yelling at me and acting like a petulant child. I'm not willing to deal with that. And I've dealt with that not only just in romantic relationships, but even in professional settings. As a lawyer, I've had people throw things at me, yell at me, scream at me. And I'm not talking about clients, I'm talking about other associates, partners at law firms doing this to me. And I refuse to endure that any longer. I refuse to endure that level of disrespect because I love and respect myself enough now to know that that's not okay. And I think that, again, for everybody, you go through that process. But for me, I really had to get to that point where I said, enough is enough. And so, with that being said, I really will just leave you with this notion of, when it comes to your mental health, right? It's going to be a journey, but all of us got here for a reason. And I think that the onus is on each of us to really look back on our past and really peel back the layers of what is going on. The reason why I found out that I had complex post traumatic stress disorder was by virtue of me talking with a psychiatrist and getting assessed, right? And talking with my therapist and having my therapist also do the assessment, and he confirmed it. And also looking at what has happened and acknowledging this. Like, oftentimes people say, when you have something that happened traumatic in childhood, it was a singular event. And for some people, it may have been that. I am fortunate in a way where I didn't experience, being sexually assaulted or anything like that. But while I didn't experience that, I had experienced chronic bullying and, in some respects, social neglect. Um, and that's kind of what happened. I mean, I essentially got left to basically get treated like shit for years and years and years. And nobody gave me a sense of recourse, and there was no way out. And so for me, my confidence suffered as a result of it. You know, um, that's kind of what ended up happening. My ability to communicate with people got affected. My feelings of whether or not I felt like I was worthy enough was affected by that. And while there was some positive gains, right, because of the fact that I did push myself to do well in school and I did push myself to do a lot of other things, the back of it, or the blowback of that, is also this consistent feeling of emptiness and unfulfillment, and this feeling of I'm never good enough, so I got to just keep proving myself and repackaging myself, to the point that now I have no identity and I have no sense of a way forward. And I robbed myself of years that I could have had fun and just had been a little bit more irresponsible, right? But now at 32, with a lot more information about my world and how I live in it and how I reason and how I rationalize things, I now feel a little bit more free. And I think that that is something that, if I offer that to anybody, that you owe it to yourself, no matter what traumas that you've been through, to at least try to inquire about what has happened and try to unpackage it and unravel it. And you don't need to do it alone, right? You need to get a good therapist. You need to go to a good psychiatrist if you need that support, or a psychologist if you need that support. Also, having a good friend group and a good village is helpful. My friend group in my village has been very helpful with me in this process. And sometimes, it also is about knowing how to be mindful of how you involve your village. Don't dump on them. Don't trauma dump on them. I had to learn that as well, not to do that. But also have real conversations and talk to your people, because ultimately you can't do this on your own. I know I tried to do it on my own and it did not succeed. So again, have your village, have your support system, and really try to tackle what you need to tackle in order for you to try to live a more fulfilled and free life. And so, with that being said, it has been a pleasure having you on this episode of Cutting the Strings. Again, I'm your host, Ivan Francis Wilbanks, and I will see you in the next one. If you liked what we had today, please like, share, and subscribe. And so long.